When we look at preventing domestic homicides, some important messages that we see over and over again from survivors is the importance of good risk assessment. We need to have timely information, timely assessments, so we can identify for victims when they are at risk. Some victims know they're at risk and they're desperately trying to seek help. Half of all victims who may become victims of repeat violence or even homicides don't recognize the risk that's present unless someone is involved with them who does a very structured interview or structured assessment.
Risk assessment is the process of trying to understand or speculate about the risks for intimate partner violence posed by a perpetrator. So trying to understand what somebody might do. In contrast, risk management is the steps that we take or the process of trying to mitigate those risks. So they're really flip sides of the same coin. On the one hand, we really need to try to understand what somebody might do in the future to be able to take preventive actions, but we don't know what preventive actions to take unless we've understood the risks that they might pose. So the assessment and the management go very closely together.
I think we're still in a way, the infancy of the use of risk assessment in domestic violence situations. Personally, I see it moving moving away from trying to predict the future, which I don't think we do very well, and more on managing risky situations in the moment. So a focus from risk assessment or risk prediction to risk management, I think, is what really needs to be done.
Risk assessment and management really help us figure out who to give services to, and then more importantly, what kind of services to give them. Sometimes people think it's enough just to say that an offender's at high risk, but we really want to know high risk for what? High risk for continuing a pattern of sort of bullying or intimidating behavior, or for physical violence that might include use of weapons or strangulation. Those are very different scenarios that we have to take into account. And then we also have to figure out what might be driving the violence. In some cases, recommending substance use treatment program or things like that for a perpetrator makes sense, but in other cases they don't. If we don't think that somebody has a substance use problem that's driving the violence, then it's going to change the way that we manage the case. So the risk assessment and management done properly helps us to identify both the people who are in need of services as well as the services that they need.
Well, there are many different risk assessment instruments out there, and many of them have been validated. And there's good research to support that they do indeed have a certain amount of predictability, that they are valid in the parlance, in the statistical language, that there is data that supports that they are fairly accurate. Not perfectly accurate. We'll never have anything that perfectly predicts that an abused woman is going to be killed or reassaulted. It's also important to distinguish between risk of reassault and risk of homicide, because although the risk factors and the instruments that assess risk of reassault are similar to the ones that assess specifically risk of homicide, there are some differences, and some of the risk factors act somewhat differently.
It's really important for us to identify which risk factors somebody has that we think are relevant or driving the violence, because that's what tells us what kind of services they need and how those services should be delivered. So it becomes logical, systematic, and prescriptive. It's still not a cookie cutter, because we're not saying, well, there's 10 things we do and there's 10 things we look at and we just prescribe them, arbitrarily. But what we're saying is for every person, we're going to look at what this person needs and the way that those services should be delivered. And that's not just services for perpetrators, for men who pose a risk, but also services for victims. And we have to try to help organize the delivery of those services, because lots of different people are involved in this process. It's not like we rely on one agency, police or probation or a women's center to deliver services. A lot of different people are involved in this. They all need to share information. But which information? How do you share it? How does it get communicated? Those are the things that the process of risk assessment and risk management should help us to coordinate.
Anybody that works with offenders or victims does do risk assessments informally, whether they call it risk assessment or not. They are doing risk assessments. They're making decisions about release of offenders or what safety precautions have to be taken with the victim and so forth. So risk assessments happen. and risk assessment tools can assist individuals to make better decisions and be more secure in their decisions, to help communicate their concerns, and most importantly, to help them develop management strategies to prevent violence from taking place.
If we develop new and better management strategies, we'll be able to improve our assessment skills even better. These things must go in tandem. To think about doing assessment without management is ridiculous. It's as dumb as saying, I'm going to give you treatment without figuring out what your problem is. So they have to go together. They're dovetailing.
Professionals, if you are working with violent offenders or their victims, I think it is your responsibility to be aware of the literature on violence risk assessment, to educate yourself about the tools that exist. Violence won't go away. Professionals are faced with violence every day, and they have to do risk assessments every day. So they probably should be aware of what's available to them to help them do their jobs.
In terms of assessment, we have a bunch of techniques that are already available. The problem is implementing them system-wide. We need to make sure that everybody's trained to use them and that everybody has some basic skills and that we're implementing those things reliably, consistently, systematically. In terms of management, again, we already have the resources. It's making sure that we're prescribing the right services for the right people. So the biggest challenge that we have right now is organizing ourselves as service providers, not changing the world. If we organize ourselves and our activities better, we'll do a better job for people.